Welcome to today's presentation. We're going to talk about a practical approach to early intervention in order to reduce sow mortality. Hello, my name is Chris Rademacher. I'm a clinical professor at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Iowa State University, also the interim director of the Iowa Pork Industry Center. The study that we did was part of the survivability grant, which was a 5-year grant gifted to a team of collaborators from Iowa State University, Kansas State University, and Purdue to study ways to improve whole herd pig survivability. And the results from all that collaborative work can be found on the website at piglivability.org. The section that we're going to focus on today here is really on sow mortality. Sow mortality really in the early 2013, 2014, as you can see depicted in the graph here, really started to see an increase. And really depending on the database that you look, we really started to see an inflection point in that 2013, 14, 15 area where we started to increase at a rate of about 0.75% to 1% or a year, a linear increase in sow mortality. This was some data provided from the PigChamp group here, and the data represented 350 farms and about 685,000 sows. So the idea, as we were preparing to look at a field-based intervention trial, was really based on some work that an intern had done during my time in practice, where we went ahead, we had a summer intern come into one of our production farms, and her job really was, over the 7 weeks that she was there, Monday through Friday, was just to go ahead and walk the gestation barns immediately after the farm staff had done their morning feeding. And her job was to really look at identifying any at-risk sows and then collecting some information on those at-risk sows that she found, and basically those ones that were sows that weren't getting up and not eating at that time. And then collecting information on them, and then looking at the treatment chart provided by the veterinarians and appropriately treating those at-risk sows. And what you can see here depicted in that the weekly death numbers from that farm was beginning on about the week that she began to do that, we immediately saw a reduction in the number of dead sows per week. Didn't carry that data all the way out, but the intern left on week 31, and we saw the number of deads per week again jump up to that 5 to 8 deads per week average. So the primary objectives within the study that we wanted to complete is we wanted to replicate that, but the objectives that we wanted to look at was, could we see a reduction in sow mortality by increasing some emphasis on identifying and treating those disadvantaged sows? So we wanted to see if we could replicate that over a longer time period. What was going to be the time requirement that was going to take on a daily basis? Because we recognized that was maybe something that this farm staff wasn't spending a lot of time doing. We wanted to try to look at that and estimate return on investment on the additional labor costs to be able to do that. And then we wanted to know, could we go ahead and spend a couple of weeks working with the farm staff, training them to do that? Could that protocol be transferred to the farm staff over that 2-week period? And then could they continue to maintain that mortality reduction after the training staff went ahead and left? So a little background on the farm that we went ahead and did the evaluation on. It was a 4,000 head sow farm here in Iowa. It had 3 large breeding and gestation buildings. They were complete stall breeding and stall gestation. There were no evaluations done in farrowing. So everything was done in breeding and gestation. It was a conventional health PRRS and mycoplasma positive farm system. They were mash fed in drop boxes that you can see pictured here. And the farm was fed once per day, first thing in the morning. At the time that the evaluation was done, the farm was running at about 17% current sow mortality. And the training was done Monday through Friday over a 2-week period in the middle of June. So looking at some of the sow mortality reasons, prior to the start, we could really divide them into 3 generalized buckets, each representing about a third. So about a third of the death reasons were pelvic organ prolapses, about a third were lameness and downers, and then a third of them would be represented as sudden deaths. The farm treatment protocol, they had one prescribed to by the herd veterinarians. And really, most of what we did during the evaluation period was really to focus on identifying the at-risk sows. And then we just went ahead and worked with the farm staff to use the farm treatment protocol according to the syndrome or the condition that was observed, and utilize the treatment protocol as you see here. So what we did during the training, the 2-week training period, was we took one of the Iowa State veterinarians and one of the gestation barn staff. And essentially they went in and fed, dropped the feed in those barns, and they would walk them as 2-man teams. We would put one person in front and one person in back, and just sequentially walked the entire stalls kind of in a snake-like fashion, with one person in front and one person behind. Any females that were not eating or up at the feeder at the time of the feeding were flagged by hanging a card. And really the idea there was maybe not to do the full complete assessment at that time, but it was really to go ahead and identify that animal for a further follow-up assessment and potential treatment at a later time period. Because generally we had fairly large gestation barns, and we had about a 30-minute time period from when the feed was first dropped until all the sows in there would finish their feed and start to lay back down. So the goal was really just to identify those that were not up and eating, so that we could come back and do further assessments and treatments at a later time period. So like I said, that was really the goal, was just to go through and assess, because we had about 30 minutes before the sows started laying back down. What I'm going to show you here is just a video of the 2-man teams walking during the time period at which the sows are being fed. So here you can see they've identified one of the females that aren't getting up. So the staff just kind of gently gets up, makes some notes about why the sow wasn't getting up, records her ID, and then would go ahead and just hang a card and then move on, continue to move on with the rest of the barn walk. Here was a video of what we found many times, and actually a further close-up of that particular sow once we got her up. This is very common as to what we found when we got many of those sows up that weren't up and eaten at the time that the rest of the population were up. You can see this one just kind of toe tap and lame, doesn't really want to put a lot of weight on that left rear leg. The trick, or the key really, is with these is to get them treated early, not to the point where we can no longer get her up without assistance and then treat her at that point. The trick is you got to really get them up early, and the fact that she's not up and eating with the rest of her cohorts at that time is really the first indication that there may be something wrong. So coming back, doing a further assessment after we get done feeding, and then identifying that she's a sow, she may have something wrong with her and need to treat her according to the treatment protocol, is really key to identifying those early on, when medical intervention may be a whole lot more successful. So here's just another example. You can see the 2 sows on either side of the sow laying down in the middle. They're up, they've cleaned their feet up, and you got one sow laying here down, not getting up, and all her feet is still laying there. So here you can see there's one that's she's been flagged, and then you've got a treatment card there with all her treatment history as well. As far as the follow-up examination and treatments, we kind of left it up to the staff in terms of what was the best time to go ahead and do the further examination. Some staff would prefer to do that right afterwards, after they went through the barn initially, and identify all the sows that they were deemed to be at risk. And some would choose to go ahead and continue on with their normal breeding duties and come back at the end of the day to do those assessments and follow-up treatments. We did make some observations during the 2 weeks that we were out there, what we were observing for the ones that were deemed to be at risk. Obviously, you can see, because the primary thing that we were using as a key for being an at-risk sow were sows that weren't up eating at the time that the rest of the herd was being fed. So off feed was the primary sign. We had about 30% of them had 2 symptoms. You can see the second most common one there in orange was lame. So 30% of them had 2 symptoms. And the most common one for that were ones that were off feed, and they were probably off feed because they were lame. So it was difficult to get up or painful. We did also look at a distribution of parity that we looked at here. This is not adjusted for parity distribution of the farm. This is just a straight percentage based on the parity of all the sows that we found. Gilts and this initial farm that we did, they were the primary parity that were identified at risk. So this was the evaluation of training. We spent the 2 weeks and then we went ahead and walked away. We did some follow-up audits at 2-week and 4-week intervals after we did the training, just to see how things were going. But what we noticed really early on was that the people in the gestation barn, they understood the value immediately, because it meant fewer dead sows that they had to pull out of the barns. So they really took to it right away. And what we really saw when we looked at the 23 weeks before we started the training period to the 23 weeks after we began, and what you can see here was about a 4.25% raw percentage reduction. So we went from 16.75 to 12.5% annualized sow mortality reduction when we compared that period of 23 weeks before to 23 weeks after. And when we looked at that, we did a chi-squared test for proportions. When comparing before and after the training, we had a p-value that was very statistically significant at 0.007 was the p-value. So this farm was within a production system. They went ahead and followed this along and followed it there, like I said, for about 23, 24 weeks. And we're very encouraged by the results that they saw, and then went ahead and started to implement it on other farms as well. So trying to estimate what was that 4%, or really that was about a 25% reduction in sow mortality. What is that 4% worth? Another portion of the survivability grant was looking at putting together some economic models. So Dr. Lee Schultz and Russ Hukin put together a breed to wean economic opportunity model. You can see there how you access that on the Ag Decision Maker website. So what they did is they built the model, and really what they're looking at there is some opportunity cost of not losing pregnant females, some additional call sow income, and then having to put fewer replacement females on the farm. So the model is available for you to use, to go ahead and use the information from your farm or system. So essentially, looking at the time that we finished that evaluation with the current input and market prices, that 4.25% reduction worked out to be about $50 a sow. So I like to put those things in cost per unit of wean pigs or per hundredweight sold. So that farm at the current production level was about would produce about 120,000 wean pigs per year. So that $50 a sow turned out to be about a $2 per wean pig savings, just by improving the sow mortality. What was the time commitment? Well, it worked out to be about 2 hours per day for at-risk identification for 2 people going through there. Although really most of that could be done and was eventually transferred once we left after our 2-week evaluation. A lot of that at-risk female identification could be done by the barn staff as they were sweeping feed into the troughs after doing their barn checks. And it kind of is going to obviously vary a little bit on herd size and the number of barns or rooms that you have, but that's what it took on this farm. And then 1 hour per day for one person to do the actual treatments. And this farm chose to do that just to minimize some of the treatment variation. So we totaled that up for this farm. It worked out to, and rounded it, worked up to be about an additional half pig full-time equivalent. So like we said, this was one farm in the system. This farm was probably one of the higher ones within the system at the time that we began the study. They went ahead and implemented tracked that data for about 6 months. And then it moved to be the first or the second within the company. So that went ahead and implemented that along with some other strategies. And you can see they went to the 2-man teams on the other farms as well. And you can see saw a really nice reduction in mortality across the system, about 3% reduction after implementation of the 2-man shoring teams, along with some other mortality initiatives that were taking place. We did want to repeat it on a farm that was doing pen gestation as well. So we took a little bit different farm style within the same system. It was a similar size farm where they bred in stalls from breeding to about 55 days of gestation. And then the animals were in pens from 55 days of gestation to farrowing. And did the training in the spring of the following year. Did have some observations from that training. It did take a little bit longer just because the setup was a little bit different. 2-man teams were still keys. We did some additional treatments for vulva bitings. We did see a little bit more of that in the group sow housed, which you probably wouldn't see in traditional stall housing. Gilt treatments, we saw a few more animals that were off feed due to some active mycoplasma infection and stall acclimatization that was taking place. So we saw a few more gilt treatments. Becomes a little bit difficult to interpret off feed during the post weaning and in and around breeding. Those animals are normally off feed just kind of due to that time period anyway. And then gilts and sows, ones that are really tough to get up may actually be suffering from front leg lameness, even though they do a really good job of disguising it. So those really stubborn ones may be hiding it. So we were a little bit more aggressive in treating those sows that were really difficult to get up at feeding time. That farm at that time had already started to, as part of the system, already went through some of the 2-man shoring teams. So they already had started to reap some of the harvest, started in weeks 10, 11, 12 here as depicted by the graph. We came in here, you can see the dotted line and the red arrow there, and did the training, spent some more time training the staff, working through it, and then once again tracked for comparing the 24 weeks before to the 24 weeks after, and we saw about a 1.2% additional reduction in sow mortality when comparing before the training to after the training. So I had already reaped some of the benefits of the 2-man shoring team. Then when we spent a little bit more time having the farm staff teaching and training in a little more intricate detail on certain things to look for, we certainly saw some additional benefit there. So kind of in summary, I think what we've learned here is we probably haven't prioritized as much early detection in individual sow treatments, particularly in breeding and gestation. And if you think about it, that's really where most of our breeding females, they spend about 85% of their life in breeding herds. That's where they spend that time. So, and I think what we saw was, for particularly ones where we only feed them once a day, lack of appetite. If they're not getting up and eating, that's probably a fantastic early indicator that something's wrong. If we're not doing that, by the time that we treat them, it may be too late. So I kind of compare it to like the individual pig care, right? For those of you who've gone through that program, we talk about, if we treat them as A pigs, we catch them early, we have a much better treatment outcome than if we wait to treat them when they're in C pigs and they're more chronic. We don't see as good a treatment outcome then. So we just have the ability, and because we're only feeding them once a day, to be able to observe whether they're eating or not. So we need to take advantage of that. And it really is a fairly easily implementable process. So it's just flagging off feed sows while the breeding and gestation staff is feeding and sweeping in that first time in the morning feeding, and then come back later and do further assessments and treat them whenever it's appropriate for the farm. So I just want to acknowledge all the collaborators that we had for the project, farm staff and the veterinarians that were involved with actually doing the training, the data analysts, and then the farm themselves. Once again, you can go to piglivability.org, get some additional information. And if you've got any questions on it, you feel free to reach out to me via email. Thank you for your time.